There are gods who arrive like weather, and there are gods who arrive like dawn. When Apollo crosses the threshold of his father's house on Olympus, the immortals do not merely notice him. They rise, they flinch. The shining ones who have ruled since the fall of the Titans push back from their golden seats, for the youth who enters carries a bow already drawn, and at the sight of him a tremor runs through the assembly of the deathless. Only one figure does not move. Leto, his mother, stays seated beside thundering Zeus, and with a tenderness that softens the whole terrible scene, she reaches out, unstrings the great bow, and closes the quiver, hanging the weapon of plague and music against the pillar of her husband's hall. Then she guides her radiant son to his place, and Zeus fills with quiet pride. This is how the oldest singers chose to introduce him. Before the loves, before the slaughter, before the oracle that would shape the destiny of nations, they wanted you to feel that single fact in your bones. Even gods are afraid of Apollo. To understand why, we must go back further, to the wandering of a desperate goddess across a world that had been forbidden to help her. His mother was Leto, and she belonged to the elder world. She was a Titaness, daughter of Coeus and Phoebe, born of that first generation of vast powers that ruled the cosmos before the gods of Olympus rose. The singers describe her as the softest and kindest of all who dwell on Olympus, mild to gods and mortals alike. From her mother Phoebe, the Titaness of radiance and prophetic light, Apollo would inherit one of his proudest names. He would be called Phoebus, the bright one, the shining one, the pure. In one solemn account, preserved by the tragedian Aeschylus, the great prophetic seat at Delphi passed down through a peaceful line of inheritance, from the primordial earth to Themis, from Themis to Phoebe, and from Phoebe, as a birthday gift, into the hands of her grandson. Even his gift of prophecy, in this telling, came to him through his grandmother's name and his grandmother's love. But before any gift could be given, the child had to be born, and his birth was a thing that the Queen of Heaven tried with all her power to prevent. For Leto had caught the eye of Zeus, the king of the gods, and she conceived by him not one child, but two, the divine twins. When Hera, the wife of Zeus, learned that her husband's mistress was carrying his children, a jealousy colder than any winter took hold of her. She swore that Leto would not give birth in any place where the sun shines. She forbade every land, every island, every patch of solid ground from offering the goddess shelter. And so began one of the loneliest journeys in all of myth. A pregnant goddess, heavy with the children of the Sky King, wandering from shore to shore, turned away again and again by terrified lands that dared not defy the wrath of Hera. In the cruelest versions of the story, Hera did not stop at forbidding the earth. She sent torment after Leto in the shape of a monstrous serpent. the great dragon called Python, an enormous coiling horror that hunted the goddess across the world and never let her rest. And she committed one final act of spite. She kept Eileithyia, the goddess of childbirth, locked away on the heights of Olympus, ignorant of Leto's labor, so that no birth could be eased and no child could be brought safely into the light. At last, exhausted and despairing, Leto came to a small and rocky island adrift in the Aegean Sea. In the most beautiful telling of the tale, this island was once a goddess herself, a sister of Leto named Asteria, who had thrown herself into the ocean to escape the pursuit of Zeus, and had become a barren rock wandering the waves, anchored to nothing, belonging to no one. The island was called Delos, the bright and the visible, and because it floated free of the world, it was technically not part of the firm earth that Hera had cursed. Here, perhaps, a child could be born. Yet even Delos was afraid. The little island spoke to the goddess, and her fear was the fear of all small things caught between great powers. She had heard, she said, that the child of Leto would be proud and overbearing, a god who would lord it over all the earth, and she dreaded that the moment he beheld her poor and rocky soil, he would spurn her, kick her down into the depths, and let the dark ocean close over her head forever. Leto answered with a solemn oath, swearing by the river Styx, the binding vow of the gods, that here her son would build his first temple, and that this barren rock would be honored above all places on earth. Comforted, the island consented. And so the goddess who had been turned away by the whole world found her refuge on a scrap of stone that had itself been an outcast. The labor was long and terrible. For 9 days and 9 nights, Leto was racked with pain, kneeling at last and clasping the trunk of a slender palm tree on the riverbank. All the great goddesses gathered around her in compassion. Dione and Rhea, Themis and the sea queen Amphitrite, every immortal woman except white-armed Hera, and except Eileithyia, whom Hera kept in ignorance upon the mountain. The watching goddesses could not complete the birth without the childbirth goddess, so they sent the messenger Iris speeding to Olympus to fetch her, bribing her with a great necklace of gold and amber to slip away. When Eileithyia at last set her foot upon Delos, the long agony broke. Leto flung her arms around the palm, pressed her knees into the soft meadow, and the child leapt into the light. In the same cycle of stories, his twin was born as well. Artemis, the wild huntress, mistress of beasts and the moon. The singers disagree about the order and the place. Some say Artemis came first, and that the newborn goddess, divine from her first breath, served as the midwife who helped deliver her brother, earning forever the title of protector of women in labor. Others fold the two birthplaces into one. The traditions differ, but they agree on the wonder of the moment. When Apollo was born, all of Delos blossomed into gold. The very rock bloomed, and a sacred company of swans is said to have circled the island 7 times, singing before the god drew his first cry. Themis, the goddess of divine law, brought the infant nectar and ambrosia, the food of immortals, and the moment the divine substance touched his lips, the child was transformed. For Apollo was no helpless babe. He burst the swaddling bands that bound him, for no mortal cloth could hold a god. And he stood upright and spoke, declaring the things that would forever be his. The curved bow would be dear to him, he said, and the lyre, and through his oracles he would reveal to mortals the unerring will of Zeus. With those words, the bright child stepped out across the wide-pathed earth, and Delos, the poor floating rock, was suddenly the proudest place in all the world, anchored at last with pillars of gold, and rooted forever to the floor of the sea. He did not remain a child for long. Some told that the swans carried him north at once, beyond the north wind itself, to the blessed land of the Hyperboreans, a people who lived in eternal sunlight at the very edge of the world, and that to this distant paradise he would return every winter, riding a chariot drawn by swans, so that his absence left the cold months empty of his light. But the great work of his youth, the deed that would define him and give him his most sacred home, waited for him in the mountains of central Greece, at a place that did not yet bear his name. Apollo set out to find a site for his oracle, a temple from which he could speak the counsels of his father to all of humankind. He came at last to a clear spring called Telphusa, and the place enchanted him, so that he announced he would lay his foundations there. But the nymph of the spring was jealous of her own quiet, and feared that the trampling of horses and the gathering of countless worshippers would steal her honor. So with cunning words, she persuaded the god that her spring was no fit place for so great a sanctuary, and she directed him instead toward a rugged spot beneath the cliffs of Mount Parnassus, not yet knowing he would one day learn of her deceit. There, beneath Parnassus, he found the place where his temple would rise, and he laid out its broad foundations. But the ground was already guarded. A monstrous serpent dwelt there, a vast she-dragon that the locals called a plague and a curse, a creature that devoured flocks and people alike, and poisoned the whole region with her presence. In many tellings, this is the very python that Hera had once sent to hound his mother across the world, now grown enormous and coiled about the sacred spring. Apollo drew the silver bow, and he loosed a single mighty arrow into the writhing bulk of the beast, and the serpent thrashed and rolled in agony, gasping out her life in great convulsions until she lay still. The god stood over the slain monster, and as the immense body began to rot in the heat of the sun, he cried out in triumph that here the creature should rot away. From that boast, the old singers explained, the place took the name Pytho, from a word that meant to rot, and the god himself won one of his titles, the Pythian. The priestess who would one day deliver his prophecies there would be called the Pythia, and the great festival held in his honor would be the Pythian Games. Beneath the temple lay the omphalos, a sacred stone the Greeks believed to be the very navel of the world. Yet there is a darker thread woven through this glory, and the storytellers did not hide it. The spilling of blood, even a monster's blood, left a stain that even a god had to answer for. So Apollo, the bright and pure one, was made to leave Delphi and journey to the lovely Vale of Tempe to be cleansed of the slaughter. And the Greeks remembered this in a ritual in which a boy was sent away in flight and brought home again, reenacting the god's own exile and return. Before he left, Apollo did not forget Telphusa, the nymph who had tricked him. He went back to her bright spring and buried it beneath a landslide of stone, raising his own altar over the smothered waters, and taking for himself the honor she had tried to keep. Now the god had his temple, but a temple needs servants, and Apollo looked across the wine-dark sea for men to tend his shrine. He spied a ship of Cretan sailors out of Knossos, honest traders bound on their own business, and resolved to take them. Leaping into the waves, he transformed himself into an enormous dolphin and hurled his glittering body aboard their vessel, so that the terrified crew dared not move, while the great creature thrashed upon their deck. He drove the ship far off its course into the gulf beneath his mountain, and there revealed himself in a blaze of divine light, no dolphin now, but a radiant young god. He told the trembling sailors that they would dwell here forever as the keepers of his sanctuary, feeding on the endless offerings that grateful mortals would bring. And because he had come to them in the shape of a dolphin, which in the Greek tongue was Delphis, the place would be called Delphi, and the god who claimed it honored as Apollo Delphinios. With that, the Oracle of Delphi was founded, the most famous voice of prophecy the ancient world would ever know. There remains the question of how this same god, this archer and slayer of dragons, became the gentlest patron of music and song. The answer lies in a story of theft, and the thief was his own infant half-brother. On the very day that Hermes was born, the son of Zeus and the shy nymph Maia, the cunning child climbed out of his cradle and went hunting for mischief. He found a tortoise at the mouth of his cave and saw at once what it could become. He scooped out the shell, fixed reeds and oxhide and the horns of cattle to it, strung it with sheep gut, and so invented the lyre, the first instrument of its kind. But singing was not enough for the newborn trickster. By evening, he crept off to the meadows where Apollo kept his sacred cattle, and he stole 50 of the finest, driving them backward so that their hoof prints pointed the wrong way, and weaving strange sandals for his own small feet, so that no tracks could be read. When Apollo discovered the theft, he was furious, and his far-seeing arts led him to the cave of Maia, where the infant Hermes lay innocently swaddled, pretending to sleep. The baby denied everything with such bold and clever lies that even the angry god was half charmed, and the matter was carried up to Olympus for Zeus to judge. The king of the gods laughed aloud at the audacity of his newborn son, and commanded that the cattle be restored. But then, with the dispute nearly settled, Hermes drew out the lyre he had hidden in his cradle and began to play. The music poured over Apollo like nothing he had ever heard, and the god of the silver bow fell silent in wonder. He declared that the song was worth more than 50 cattle, that their quarrel was over, and he offered the herd freely in exchange for the instrument. So Hermes gave Apollo the lyre and kept the cattle, and from that day the lyre became Apollo's own, the second great symbol of his nature. He became the lord of music, the leader of the 9 muses, the god whose playing made the immortals forget all sorrow, and whose voice could raise even the stones of cities into walls. By now, the shape of the god was complete, and it was a strange and double shape. He was the bringer of plague and the lord of healing, for the same arrows that spread disease could also be begged to withdraw it. He was the god of sudden death, and the god who taught the mending of wounds, prophecy and music and poetry together, the patron of archers and herdsmen, the punisher of the proud, and the protector of the young. The Greeks called him by a crowd of names, each catching a different facet. Phoebus the radiant, Loxias, the speaker of riddling oracles, Smintheus, the bringer of pestilence, Nomios, the herdsman, Paean, the healer, Musagetes, the leader of the muses, and Hecatebolos, the one who strikes from far away. In the earliest understanding, he was not the sun itself, for that was the work of the Titan Helios. Only in the later centuries, in the age after Alexander and among the Romans, did the two slowly merge until Apollo became the radiant sun god of countless paintings and poems. But in the oldest stories, his light is the light of clarity and truth, the unbearable brightness of a god who sees all and cannot be deceived, a far stranger and more frightening thing than mere sunshine. For all his brilliance, Apollo was strangely unlucky in love, and his loves became some of the most haunting stories the Greeks ever told. The first and the most famous began with arrogance. Fresh from his triumph over the great serpent, swollen with pride, the young god came upon Eros, the small winged power of desire, bending a little bow, and mocked him for handling weapons that belonged to the slayer of Python. Eros, stung, climbed to the peak of Parnassus and drew 2 arrows from his quiver. One was tipped with gold, and kindled love, and one was tipped with dull lead, and drove love away. He shot the golden arrow deep into the heart of Apollo, and he shot the leaden arrow into a river nymph named Daphne, a free-spirited huntress, who had sworn to remain forever unwed. So the god who could pierce a monster from across the world was himself pierced, and he burned with a longing he could not master. He pursued Daphne through the woods, promising her everything, but she fled from him in terror, for the leaden arrow had filled her with horror at the very thought of him. He gained on her, swift as a god, until his breath stirred the hair on her neck. And in her last extremity, she cried out to her father, the river god Peneus, to change her shape and save her. The answer came at once. A heavy numbness spread through her limbs. Bark closed over her soft breast. Her hair became leaves, her arms became branches, her swift feet rooted into the earth. And where the running girl had been, there stood a slender laurel tree, trembling in the wind. Apollo embraced the trunk and felt the heart still fluttering beneath the new wood, and even now the branches seemed to shrink from his touch. Since he could not have her as a bride, he made her his emblem instead. The laurel would be forever sacred to him, its leaves woven into the crowns of victors and poets, a memorial to the love that froze into wood rather than yield. His other loves carried the same shadow of loss, and one of them gave the world its greatest healer. Apollo loved a mortal princess of Thessaly named Coronis, and she conceived his child. But while the child still grew within her, Coronis betrayed the god's bed with a mortal man. A white raven, his own sacred bird, brought him the bitter news, and in his black rage at the message, Apollo scorched the bird's feathers forever, which is why all ravens since have been the color of soot. Then the god turned his fury on Coronis. Some say he struck her down himself, others that he set his sister Artemis to do it. But in either telling she died for her betrayal. Only as her body lay upon the funeral pyre did his grief overtake his anger. He could not bear to let his unborn son burn with her. So he snatched the living child from the flames and the dead mother's womb, and named him Asclepius. This rescued infant he gave to the wise centaur Chiron to raise. And under the centaur's teaching, Asclepius grew into the greatest physician the world had ever known, whose skill in his father's medical art would surpass all mortals. Remember that name, for the fate of Asclepius would one day turn his radiant father against the throne of heaven. Not every love ended in death. Apollo loved a fearless young huntress named Cyrene, whom he watched wrestling a lion bare-handed on the slopes of Mount Pelion. And so taken was he with her courage that he carried her across the sea to Libya, gave a whole country her name, and made her a queen. Their son, Aristeus, became a rustic god, the teacher of beekeeping and the cultivation of the olive. Yet, even where Apollo did not lose his beloved to death, he sometimes lost the contest of the heart. He desired a princess named Marpessa, and competed for her against a bold mortal hero named Idas. And when Zeus granted the woman herself the right to choose, Marpessa chose the mortal, fearing that an immortal lover would abandon her when age withered her beauty, while he stayed forever young. Even Apollo could not gainsay so wounding a choice. And there was Cassandra, the princess of Troy, whose story is the cruelest of all, for it shows the gods' love curdling into a punishment that shaped the doom of a whole city. Apollo desired the beautiful daughter of King Priam, and to win her favor, he offered her the most precious of his gifts, the power of true prophecy. She accepted it and let him teach her. But when the time came to give herself to him in return, she refused. The god could not take back what he had given, for the gifts of the gods, once granted, cannot be revoked. So instead he twisted it into a curse. He breathed upon her, and with that breath he laid upon her the doom that no one would ever believe her prophecies. From then on, Cassandra saw every disaster before it came. She foresaw the fall of Troy, the trick of the wooden horse, the slaughter of her family, her own death, and not one soul believed a word she spoke. She was thought mad, while the truth screamed inside her, unheeded, until it all came to pass exactly as she had seen. The most tender and most sorrowful of his loves was for a youth, a Spartan prince of extraordinary beauty named Hyacinthus. The god loved the boy with a devotion that drew him down from Olympus to spend his days hunting and walking the hills of Laconia. But Hyacinthus was beautiful enough to draw the eye of another power. Zephyrus, the west wind, also loved the youth, and burned with jealousy to see him give all his affection to Apollo. One bright day, the god and the boy stripped down to play at throwing the discus, and as Hyacinthus ran laughing to catch the heavy disc Apollo had hurled, the jealous west wind swept down and turned it aside, driving it hard against the boy's head. He fell, the blood pouring out, and though Apollo was the god of healing and gathered the dying youth into his arms, no medicine could call him back. As the god wept over the body, he swore that his beloved would not be forgotten, and from the spilled blood he caused a flower to spring up. The hyacinth, and on its petals, the singers said, were marks that looked like the letters of a cry of grief, so that the very flower would mourn the boy forever. The Spartans honored Hyacinthus with a great yearly festival, weaving the death of the beloved into the worship of the god who could not save him. Now we return to Asclepius, the son rescued from the flames, for his story is where the bright god's tale turns to thunder. Under the teaching of Chiron, Asclepius became so skilled in medicine that he could do what no healer had ever done. He learned to bring the dead back to life. This terrified Zeus. If men could be raised from death, then the boundary between mortal and immortal would collapse, and the dead would empty out of the underworld back into the light. To restore the order of the cosmos, the king of the gods seized a thunderbolt and struck Asclepius down. When Apollo learned that his father had murdered his son, a grief and a rage beyond reason took hold of him. He could not strike at Zeus, the master of the thunder. So he struck at the makers of the weapon instead. He sought out the Cyclopes, the one-eyed giant smiths who forged the thunderbolts in the deep workshops beneath the earth, and he killed them with his arrows, slaying the very craftsmen of his father's power. This was a crime against the order of Olympus itself, and Zeus, enraged, prepared to hurl his own son down into Tartarus, the black pit far below the underworld. But Leto, the gentle mother, interceded for her child once more, and the king relented. Instead of eternal imprisonment, Apollo was sentenced to a humiliation. He, a god of Olympus, would be stripped of his divine privilege and bound to serve a mortal man as a common laborer. The traditions differ on the length of his sentence, some saying a single year, some 9 years, and some 1 great year of 8, but all agree on the shame of it, that the shining one was made a servant. They differ on the cause as well, some tying his servitude to the slaying of the Cyclopes, and others to the bloodshed at Delphi. But the outcome is the same. The master he was sent to serve was Admetus, the young king of Pherae in Thessaly. And here the bitter sentence turned unexpectedly sweet. Admetus was a man of rare kindness, and he treated his mysterious new herdsman with warmth and respect, not knowing at first that he was housing a god. Apollo tended the king's cattle, earning thereby his title Nomaios, the herdsman, and his presence blessed the whole estate. Every cow in the herd bore twins. The flocks multiplied beyond all reason, and the year of servitude became a strange idyll, the god of light living humbly among the herds of a good man who had shown him grace. When his service ended, Apollo repaid that kindness many times over. When the king sought to marry the princess Alcestis, whose father had set the impossible condition that her suitor yoke a wild lion and a wild boar to a single chariot, it was Apollo who tamed the savage beasts and brought them gentle to the yoke, so that Admetus won his bride. But the greatest gift Apollo gave to Admetus was also the most dangerous. Knowing that his friend's appointed day of death was coming, the god went to the Fates, the 3 ancient sisters who spin and measure and cut the thread of every life, and won from them an almost unheard-of concession. In one striking account, he made the Fates drunk, and in their wine-softened mood they agreed that Admetus could escape his destined death on one condition. Someone else, freely willing, must die in his place. When the day came, the king discovered that no one would take his place. Not his soldiers, not his friends, not even his aged father, who clung jealously to the few years he had left. Only his wife Alcestis loved him enough to lay down her own life so that he might live. That a god could bend the fates themselves, even for a single mortal, is a measure of what Apollo was, and the cost of it, paid by a faithful wife, is a measure of what such favors truly mean. Servitude came to Apollo more than once. In another episode, he and the sea god Poseidon were both bound for a year to the service of Laomedon, the king of Troy, set to build the mighty walls of the city. And some singers said Apollo raised the stones not by labor, but by music, playing his lyre so that the ramparts rose of their own accord. When the work was done, the gods came for the wages they had been promised. But the king, proud and faithless, refused to pay them and threatened to sell them as slaves and cut off their ears. The gods departed in wrath. Poseidon sent a monstrous beast from the sea to ravage the Trojan shore, and Apollo, the healer, became the bringer of plague, sweeping pestilence through the city of the man who had cheated him. The seed of Troy's destruction was planted in that broken promise. For Apollo's mercy was real, but so was his wrath, and the swift arrows that struck from afar fell upon any who dishonored him or his family. His mother Leto he guarded with a ferocity that became legendary. There was a queen named Niobe, the wife of the king of Thebes, blessed with a great brood of children, 7 sons and 7 daughters in the common count. Swollen with pride in her own fertility, Niobe dared to compare herself to Leto, and to scoff at the goddess for having borne only 2 children, forbidding the women of Thebes to worship her. The insult reached the divine twins, and their answer was annihilation. Apollo shot down every one of Niobe's sons, one after another, as Artemis shot down every one of her daughters, until the whole proud family lay dead in their own blood. The bodies lay unburied for 9 days while the stricken mother neither ate nor wept. At last, broken utterly, Niobe was carried back to her homeland and turned to stone upon a mountainside, a weeping rock from which water still seemed to trickle like endless tears, a monument to the lesson that no mortal may set herself beside a god. The same protective fury fell upon a giant named Tityus, an enormous son of the earth, who, inflamed with lust, dared to lay hands upon Leto as she traveled. The twins struck him down with their arrows, and in the depths of the underworld, his body was stretched across acres of ground, while 2 vultures tore endlessly at his liver, which grew back each time it was devoured, so that his agony would never cease. Apollo guarded his own honor as jealously as his mother's, especially the honor of his music. There was a satyr named Marsyas, a wild creature of the woods, who found a double-piped flute that the goddess Athena had thrown away in disgust, for it had spoiled her beauty when she played it. Marsyas took up the instrument and became so brilliant a piper that pride overtook him. and he challenged Apollo himself to a contest. The satyr with his pipes against the god with his lyre, on terms that the winner could do as he pleased with the loser. The contest was close, until Apollo turned his lyre upside down and continued to play just as beautifully, then sang to its strings, and dared Marsyas to do the same. But a flute cannot be played upside down, and no one can sing while blowing into one, and so the satyr lost. The god's vengeance was without mercy. He had Marsyas hung from a tree and flayed alive for daring to match himself against a god. It is the cruelest face of Apollo, the reminder that beneath the patron of harmony there lived a being who would tolerate no rival and forgive no insult. Even the great hero Heracles felt the god's defense of his sacred places. Driven half-mad and sick, Heracles came to Delphi to beg the oracle for a cure. And when the Pythia refused to answer, the enraged hero seized the sacred tripod and made to carry it off to set up an oracle of his own. Apollo would not suffer such a violation, and the god and the hero, two sons of Zeus, wrestled for the tripod until Zeus himself flung a thunderbolt between them to part his quarreling sons. So fiercely did Apollo guard the navel of the world. All these threads of the god's nature came together in the great war that the Greeks remembered above all others, the war for Troy, where Apollo took his place firmly on the side of the Trojans, the descendants of the people whose walls he had razed. The war poem opens with his wrath. A priest of Apollo, named Chrysis, came to the Greek camp to ransom his captured daughter. And when the commander Agamemnon scorned the old man and drove him away, the priest prayed to his god for vengeance. Apollo heard him. He came down from the peaks of Olympus with night upon his face, his bow and quiver rattling on his shoulders, and loosed his plague arrows into the Greek host. First the mules and the dogs, then the men, and for 9 days the pyres of the dead burned without cease, until the Greeks gave up the priest's daughter, and begged the gods' forgiveness with sacrifice and song. Throughout the long war, Apollo moved among the fighters, shielding his favorites and turning the tide. He breathed strength into the Trojan champion Hector, and stood like an unseen wall before the gates of the city. In the most fateful moment of the war, when the Greek hero Patroclus charged in glory against the walls of Troy, it was Apollo who struck him from behind in the chaos of battle, knocking the helmet from his head and loosening the armor from his body, leaving him dazed and defenseless so that the Trojans could cut him down. The death of Patroclus brought the terrible rage of Achilles back into the war. And so, even in defending Troy, Apollo wove the threads that would destroy it. And when, at last, Achilles raged unstoppable against the city, it was Apollo who brought him down, guiding the arrow of the Trojan prince Paris, an archer of no special skill, straight to the one vulnerable point on the body of the greatest warrior alive, his heel, so that the man no spear could pierce, was felled by a single shaft, sped true by the unseen hand of the far shooter. But the most lasting of all Apollo's works was not war or vengeance or even love. It was the voice that spoke from the smoke at Delphi, the oracle he had founded over the bones of the slain serpent. There, in the inner sanctum of the temple, the priestess called the Pythia sat upon the sacred tripod above a cleft in the earth, and the god spoke through her in riddling, slanting words, which is why he bore the name Loxias, the oblique one. For more than 1,000 years, the leaders of the ancient world came to that mountainside to ask the will of the god before they founded cities, waged wars, or chose their kings. Carved upon the temple were the two great commands that summed up the god's whole demand upon humanity: to know oneself, and to keep all things in measure, nothing in excess. The oracle's pronouncements were famously double-edged, true in ways no one expected. Apollo's truth was never comforting and never simple. It was the truth of a god who saw clearly and let mortals destroy themselves on the rocks of their own misunderstanding. His gift of prophecy spread beyond Delphi through the figures called the Sibyls, inspired prophetesses who spoke his words at shrines across the ancient world. The most famous was the Sibyl of Cumae in Italy, and her story carries the same bittersweet sting as so many of Apollo's gifts. The god, desiring her, offered her any wish she could name. She scooped up a handful of sand and asked to live for as many years as there were grains in her hand. But in her haste, she forgot to ask also for lasting youth. Because she then refused him, her wish was fulfilled exactly as she had spoken it. She lived on for centuries, aging and withering with every passing year, shrinking until at last almost nothing was left of her but a tiny voice whispering that she only wished to die. Once again, the gift of the god was real, and once again it became a kind of curse, because mortals never know what to ask for. Apollo never died, for he was a god of the deathless ones, and the Greeks gave him no ending. He remained forever the beautiful youth, eternally young, while everything he loved grew old and passed away. That, perhaps, is the deepest sorrow buried in all his stories, that he could not keep what he loved, neither Daphne, nor Coronis, nor Hyacinthus, nor Cassandra, nor the long-lived Sibyl, because everything mortal slips away from a god who cannot follow it into death. His final fate, if a god can be said to have one, was the slow fading of his worship as the ancient world gave way to new faiths, and the famous story of the closing of his oracle. In the last days of the old religion, when a Roman emperor sought to restore the worship of the old gods and sent to Delphi for a prophecy, the legend says the oracle gave its final answer, a mournful word that the beautiful hall had fallen, that the god had no shelter and no prophetic spring any longer, and that the talking water had run dry. Whether those words were truly spoken or the invention of a later age, they capture something real. The voice that had guided the ancient world for 1,000 years fell silent. Yet he did not vanish. His legacy outlived his altars. When the Romans absorbed the gods of Greece, they found no native god of their own to match Apollo, and so they took him whole, name and image and stories together. The only great Olympian they adopted without renaming. The image of the radiant archer with the lyre became one of the central symbols of beauty and order in Western art, the very idea of the Apollonian, the clear, the measured, the harmonious, set against the wild and ecstatic. His son Asclepius, though struck down by Zeus, was eventually raised to the heavens as the god of healing himself, and shrines in his name spread across the ancient world, the distant ancestors of the physician's art. The laurel he won in his grief still crowns the victorious. The lyre he took from a thieving infant still stands as the emblem of music and poetry. And the command carved on his temple, to know oneself, has echoed down the centuries long after the smoke of Delphi grew cold. This is the full measure of Apollo. He was the god whose arrival made the immortals tremble, and the god whose music made them forget their grief. He was the slayer of the great serpent, and the bringer of plague, the healer and the destroyer, the lover who could not hold what he loved, and the prophet whose truth no one wished to hear. He was the brightness that reveals all things, and the brightness that burns. The Greeks did not imagine him as kind, and they did not imagine him as cruel. They imagined him as something harder and stranger than either, a perfect clarity that does not soften itself for human comfort. To stand in the light of Apollo was to see the truth, and the truth, his worshippers knew, has no mercy and needs none. It simply shines,